Alright, welcome back. Today we're going to be making buttermilk biscuits from scratch. So I'm going to start off by making my own butter, but this is by no means required and you can definitely use store-bought butter. I just was having some fun this day. So, to the bowl of a stand mixer, I've added some heavy whipping cream, and I'm just going to beat this on medium-high speed until it starts to thicken and turn to whipped cream. As you can see here, the ribbons are starting to form, it's thickening up, and we've got ourselves some nice whipped cream. But to get butter, we're going to let this go a little longer. So as you can see here, it's actually starting to separate into the buttermilk and the butter solids. It's broken. So we're going to let it go a little bit longer and then turn off our mixer. So from here, we're going to want to gather up our butter so that we can clean it. The reason we want to clean our butter is because the excess liquid inside of it gives bacteria a good environment to grow, which will lead to our butter spoiling. So we want to get as much of the buttermilk out as is possible. So here I'm just squeezing out as much of the excess buttermilk as I can and grabbing the excess bits of butter from the bottom of the bowl. I'm then going to go ahead and rinse it in ice water. The reason we're using ice water is just to keep the butter cold and so it doesn't melt. Now here I'm just squishing out as much of the buttermilk as I can, kneading it a little bit. And then I'm going to wrap it up and throw it in the fridge because we want our butter to be as cold as possible for this recipe. I'm also going to strain off our buttermilk, get rid of any excess butter solids that are in there, and throw that in the fridge so it's nice and cold. So here we've got 1 tablespoon of baking powder, 1/4 teaspoon of baking soda, 1.5 teaspoons of kosher salt, and then we've got 2 cups of unbleached flour. We've also got our butter from before and the buttermilk from before. So if you're using your own butter, you're going to want to have 10 tablespoons of butter total. So that's 1 stick plus 2 tablespoons. The 1 stick is going to be thrown in with the flour and the other 2 will be melted for brushing on top. We've also got 1/2 cup of sour cream. So with the food processor here, we're going to go ahead and add all our powdered ingredients and just blitz gently to mix together. If you don't have a food processor, you can still make this recipe. You're just going to have to be breaking up the butter by hand and crumbling it between your fingers rather than using a food processor, which is totally fine. So here I'm weighing out my butter, but as I mentioned before, you can just use 1 stick of butter in place here. So here we're going to mix our sour cream and our buttermilk and just whisk that together just to break up the sour cream. Now we're going to add our cold butter straight out of the fridge into our flour. So at this point, if you're using your hands, you can simply cover the butter and flour and start crumbling it beneath your fingers, breaking it up into about pea-sized pieces. Here, we're just going to blitz it a few times with the food processor until we achieve a similar result. Now, we do want the butter to be as cold as possible, so if you are doing this by hand, try not to overhandle the butter and have it melt into the flour. We'd like cold, solid pieces. So we're going to go ahead and take that butter and flour mixture and add that to our liquids. And just with the spatula, we're just going to start to bring the dough together. Now this dough will look very dry, and that's because it is a dry dough. We don't want to have too much liquid here. It's going to be a pretty shaggy dough, and that's going to actually help us with getting a nice flaky buttermilk biscuit. So I've just turned out this very shaggy ball of dough onto the counter, and I'm just gently trying to coax all of these rogue pieces into the main mass. So I'm cleaning off my fingers, wiping off the counter, trying to get everything into one single piece of dough. And then I'm going to start folding it over itself, just to develop a little bit of gluten so it doesn't start to fall apart on us, as well as to start forming layers. So, the way buttermilk biscuits, and croissant for that matter, rise is through a process called lamination. Basically what that is we create very thin layers of butter that when we throw it in the oven, evaporate, or the water inside the butter evaporates, and it produces rise, which lifts our biscuits. So the way we do that is by leveling out our dough nice and thin, and then folding it onto itself like an envelope. And we're going to do this twice to create a lot of layers so that we get a nice fluffy and risen biscuit. So here I'm starting to gently roll out the dough, flouring liberally as you need it to stop it from sticking to the spatula and breaking up, and trying to form an approximate square. It'll be harder on your first try just because the dough will be kind of a rough shape. The second time you do this, it'll be a lot easier to form it into a proper rectangle or square. So here you see I'm just folding left and right over like an envelope, and then I'm going to do the same front to back. So now that we've gotten our dough into a nice square, we're going to repeat that process. Flour a bit more, make sure nothing's sticking, roll it back out again, and repeat the entire process. This really helps build a lot of layers and will help our biscuits poof up really nicely. So as you can see here, it's a little bit easier to keep it into a square, but still having a bit of trouble. Personally, I find that using a bench scraper for these types of things is very helpful and keeps the dough from sticking to me and gets nice even lines, but it's totally not required. So here we're going to do it again, left side over, right side over, front over, back over, just like folding a letter. And then we're going to roll it out one more time to the correct thickness that we're going to use to cut our biscuits. At this point, you may notice the dough is resisting you more. That's because all of this rolling and folding has actually built gluten. So just be patient with it, gently try to coax it out, and it will eventually get there. So here I'm going to go and make 9 biscuits, though you can break this up into even more. I wanted larger pieces because I was having this with pulled pork. I wanted to use them as little mini sandwiches. You could definitely go and double the amount of biscuits you get out of this recipe and get the more typical smaller size biscuits. So the 2 tablespoons of butter I mentioned earlier are going to be brushed on top just before we throw these in the oven. So these are going to go into a 425 degree oven for 15 minutes. We are going to go ahead and turn these halfway through. Alright, and that is it for this video. If you haven't checked out the corresponding pulled pork video, check that out now, it's already up on the channel. Other than that, thanks for watching. Hope to see you next time.